Picture a heavily armored knight. He shivers uncontrollably inside a massive stone fortress. A roaring fireplace burns nearby. Yet, he is dying of the cold. Now, picture a starving peasant miles away. This peasant wears nothing but stolen, damp rags. He is buried deep within the frozen, unforgiving heart of the forest. The temperature has plummeted well below zero. According to all laws of nature, the peasant should be a frozen corpse by dawn. But the sun rises. The night is dead. The peasant is alive. This is not a dark fairy tale. This was the brutal reality of medieval England. We have completely forgotten the ancient survival secrets these desperate men knew. To understand their absolute genius, you first need to understand their living nightmare. Being declared an outlaw in the Middle Ages did not mean you were just a common criminal. It meant you were entirely erased from humanity. You were stripped of all legal protection. You became less than a stray dog. Any person could hunt you down and slit your throat on sight. There was no trial. There was no judge. There was only a body dumped in a ditch and a bounty collected by your own neighbor. You might wonder why a sane person would choose a freezing forest over sneaking back into a warm town. The answer is simple. The towns were absolute death traps. Civilization offered only a fast and agonizing end. If the sheriff's men caught you, the best you could hope for was a swift hanging. The unlucky ones faced horrific mutilation or branding with red-hot iron. So, these men chose the bitter cold. They chose the terrifying wilderness. They chose a slow, probable death over a certain agonizing one. Most of these outlaws were not the romantic heroes like Robin Hood that you see in modern movies. They were ordinary, starving farmers who could not pay their crippling debts. They were desperate fathers who poached a single rabbit on the king's land just to feed their crying children. Historical records show that King William the Conqueror and his successors had claimed vast territories as royal forests. By the 12th century, these dense, terrifying woodlands covered nearly 30% of all England. This massive green ocean was entirely unpatrolled. The sheriffs and their bounty hunters relied heavily on war horses. Horses require clear paths and solid ground. The deep, tangled interior of the forest offered neither. The mounted patrols stubbornly stuck to the safe, established tracks at the edge of the woods. They were terrified of the dark unknown. And then came the brutal winter. You might think the dropping temperatures would spell the end for these fugitives, but the bitter cold actually provided one massive life-saving advantage. Frozen, rock-hard ground does not hold human footprints. A sheriff could easily track a fleeing man through the soft, wet mud of October for miles. But when the deep frost of December arrived, a man's trail vanished into thin air. The snow became their ultimate shield against the law. But hiding from the sheriff's men was only the very first step in a terrifying ordeal. Evading capture meant absolutely nothing if the freezing wind stopped your heart while you slept. Surviving the night required constructing a shelter out of nothing but bare hands and desperation. Imagine the sheer panic of racing against the setting sun. The winter sky turns a bruised purple as the temperature plummets. You have successfully vanished into the endless woodland, but nature is now your executioner. Finding a place to sleep is no longer about comfort. It is a brutal, frantic calculation to avoid waking up as a block of ice. The very first instinct of a fleeing man is to seek out the ancient sanctuary of the earth. He looks for caves. Any seasoned outlaw desperately hunted for natural rock overhangs and shallow caverns before daring to build anything from scratch. The science behind this is brilliantly simple. Solid stone absorbs and retains ambient heat far more effectively than a flimsy wall of sticks. Furthermore, nature has already completed the grueling construction process millions of years ago. But this primal real estate came with a terrifying catch. A dry, deep cave was an incredibly rare prize in the English wilderness, and the outlaws were rarely the first ones to claim it. Desperate men often had to fight territorial bears, packs of starving wolves, or even rival bandits who were willing to murder for a warm corner. When the rocks offered no mercy, these fugitives were forced to dig their own salvation. They constructed pit houses, which were the medieval equivalent of a subterranean fortress. Using scavenged tools or their bleeding hands, they excavated a hole roughly 3 feet deep into the unforgiving soil. They would then weave a thick roof of fallen branches and forest debris over the top before sliding into the dark pit. They were tapping into the Earth's natural geothermal insulation. At just 3 feet below the surface, the ground temperature remains remarkably stable throughout the harsh winter. It hovers around a consistent 50 degrees Fahrenheit. 50 degrees is certainly not a tropical paradise, but when you are shivering in stolen, threadbare wool and your last meal was a scrawny squirrel, that subtle heat radiating from the dirt is an absolute lifesaver. For those caught completely off guard by a sudden blizzard, the massive hollow logs of ancient fallen trees became emergency coffins of warmth. It sounds like a ridiculous myth. However, wedging your body into the rotting center of a massive oak tree worked exceptionally well. Your own trapped body heat rapidly filled that claustrophobic wooden shell. It was a terrifying, suffocating experience, but it kept the blood flowing through your veins. When outlaws banded together in larger groups, the legendary Bender shelter became their standard fortress. They gathered flexible young saplings and forcefully bent them into interlocking arches. They piled massive amounts of bracken, dead leaves, and thick moss over this wooden skeleton. They layered the insulation up to 2 feet thick on every single side. They were essentially constructing a giant leafy cocoon that trapped their collective body heat. The exact location of this shelter meant the difference between life and death. Smart outlaws deliberately chose south-facing slopes to capture every fleeting ray of the weak winter sun. They strategically positioned large hills directly behind their camps to block the savage, howling northern winds. A single mistake in positioning would transform their meticulously built shelter into a deadly wind tunnel. They even used the heavy snowfall to their advantage. They allowed the deep snow to pile high against the walls of their huts. The dead airspace trapped within the crystalline layers of snow acts as a perfect natural insulator. These starving, uneducated peasants mastered thermodynamics centuries before modern survival experts began charging fortunes to teach the exact same concepts. But even the most perfectly insulated shelter was completely useless without one vital element. You absolutely needed the power of fire. Managing a roaring flame while actively hiding from armed bounty hunters required an elite level of stealth engineering. Fire was never a luxury in the frozen forest. It was the literal dividing line between greeting the morning sun and becoming a frozen meal for wild scavengers. Medical science tells us a terrifying truth about the human body. A wet, physically exhausted person exposed to near-freezing temperatures can completely succumb to hypothermia in under 3 hours. Your organs shut down, your brain stops functioning, and your heart simply quits. Therefore, the outlaws treated their fire-making tools with a religious reverence. But creating a fire in the woods creates a massive, deadly problem. Burning wood produces thick, billowing pillars of smoke. That smoke can be seen from miles away against a gray winter sky. It was practically a beacon screaming for the sheriff's men to come and collect their bounty. So these desperate fugitives had to invent a flawless, invisible heat source. Their ultimate secret weapon was the legendary Dakota fire hole. Imagine digging 2 vertical holes deep into the forest floor. Then, you dig a horizontal tunnel underneath the ground to connect them. You build your fire in the first hole. The second hole acts as a natural air intake, pulling oxygen down and feeding it directly into the base of the flames. This underground vacuum effect creates an incredibly intense, superheated combustion. Because the fire burns so incredibly hot, it consumes the smoke particles before they can even escape the hole. It is a masterpiece of medieval engineering that produces fierce heat with almost zero visible smoke. But a smokeless fire still requires the right kind of fuel. Burning wet or frozen wood creates a blinding white smoke that completely destroys the illusion. Experienced outlaws planned weeks ahead, hoarding dry, dead branches inside their shelters to ensure a steady supply of safe fuel. Their patience was a literal survival tactic, and the sacred tools required to ignite that fuel were guarded with their lives. A piece of hardened fire steel and a sharp flint rock were often the only metal objects an outlaw possessed. They wrapped these precious items in thick animal leather. They kept this survival kit tied directly against their bare skin at all times to keep it dry and warm. Losing your flint in the dead of December was an immediate death sentence. When night fell, the glowing light of the flames became just as dangerous as the smoke. The outlaws solved this by keeping their fires buried in deep pits or hiding them behind massive natural rock formations. They knew that a single stray spark visible on a dark ridgeline would bring the executioners to their camp before dawn. Before going to sleep, they utilized a brilliant banking technique. They carefully buried their glowing red-hot coals beneath a thick layer of fine ash and completely dry soil. This starved the fire of oxygen just enough to keep the embers alive, but entirely hidden. When the sun rose, they simply brushed away the dirt, exposing the hot coals to the morning air. This allowed them to instantly restart their fire without going through the dangerous, noisy process of striking sparks in the freezing dawn. Yet, successfully mastering the element of fire and escaping the freezing air was only half of their epic battle. The true executioner of the forest was not the cold air itself, but a silent, clinging killer that soaked through their defenses. Most modern minds harbor a fatal misconception about the medieval winter. They foolishly assume that the biting cold air was the primary executioner. This is a deadly myth. The absolute true killer in the dark forest was the wet cold. A hardened outlaw could mentally withstand plummeting sub-zero temperatures. But the moment his clothing became soaked through with freezing rain or melted snow, his fate was sealed. Once moisture breached your defenses, it violently sucked the precious body heat right out of your core. Common fabrics like cheap linen or cotton instantly transformed into icy death shrouds. The wet material would violently cling to the skin, accelerating the onset of severe hypothermia faster than the winter wind ever could. This desperate reality elevated thick, heavy wool into the most valuable substance on Earth. Wool possessed a magical, life-saving property that medieval fugitives exploited to the absolute limit. Even when completely drenched in freezing water, a dense wool cloak retained roughly 80% of its critical insulating ability. Many ingenious outlaws survived by wearing stolen, heavy sheepskins. They deliberately turned the raw fleece inward, pressing the thick wool directly against their shivering bare skin. This trapped their core body heat perfectly, utilizing the exact same thermal principles as the most expensive modern winter survival gear. But protecting the chest and back meant nothing if a man lost his feet to the black rot of frostbite. Standard medieval peasant shoes were little more than flimsy leather socks, suffering from severe delusions of grandeur. They offered zero insulation and became slippery, frozen death traps in the treacherous winter slush. Therefore, veteran forest dwellers completely abandoned traditional footwear. Instead, they tightly bound their bare feet and lower legs in long, thick strips of scavenged woolen fabric. It looked incredibly primitive, like the ragged bindings of a walking corpse. Yet these crude wrappings could be perfectly adjusted for swelling, and they dried infinitely faster near a fire than any heavy leather boot ever could. To further fortify their makeshift armor, these desperate men turned to a truly foul-smelling tactic. They aggressively rubbed thick, rancid animal fat deep into the fibers of their wool and leather garments. The stench was absolutely horrific, turning their camps into foul-smelling dens. However, this greasy, repulsive coating created a brilliant, highly effective waterproofing layer. It blocked the savage winds and forced the freezing rain to beat up and roll right off their backs. Because heavy wool was so critical, violent raids on isolated winter farmsteads were rarely driven by simple greed. They were terrifying, calculated survival missions specifically designed to steal blankets and thick cloaks from unsuspecting villagers. But achieving perfect warmth instantly introduced a far more agonizing problem. All the animal fat and heavy wool in the kingdom were completely worthless if a man was slowly starving to death from the inside out. Securing food in a frozen wasteland required forbidden knowledge that could easily get a man hanged from the highest tree. Poaching the king's royal deer was an ultimate crime punishable by a swift, brutal execution. Yet, the outlaws relentlessly hunted these magnificent beasts anyway. The threat of a distant hangman's noose loses all its terrifying power when the immediate agony of starvation is already tearing at your stomach. A single massive red deer could yield over 50 pounds of rich, life-saving meat. That extraordinary bounty guaranteed weeks of survival for a starving camp. It was a massive risk, but an absolutely necessary one when a man could clearly see his own ribs protruding through his pale skin. However, the most cunning survivors knew that constantly hunting giant game drew far too much unwanted attention from the sheriff's heavily armed patrols. The true unsung heroes of medieval winter survival were the humble wild rabbits. Under the complex forest laws of the era, rabbits were frequently not classified as royal game. This massive legal loophole meant that setting hidden snares near the forest edge could secure a hot dinner without automatically triggering a death sentence. A fugitive could carefully arrange a simple loop of braided plant fiber along a heavily trafficked rabbit run. This silent, deadly trap hunted for him while he slept safely in his hidden pit. The brutal winter season also provided hunters with a shocking, unexpected advantage. A fresh layer of pristine white snow transformed the chaotic forest floor into a flawless, highly detailed tracking map. Every single deer, rabbit, and wandering squirrel left a crystal-clear record of its exact movements. Furthermore, the deep winter freeze made the wild animals incredibly desperate and careless. They were starving just like the outlaws, forcing them out into the open to search for buried roots. The fugitives ruthlessly hunted anything that possessed a heartbeat and edible flesh. Squirrels, tiny dormice, and even prickly hedgehogs became highly prized targets. They offered very little meat, but this steady, vital stream of protein slowly accumulated to keep a human heart beating. They built remarkably quiet, tension-sprung traps from bent saplings to instantly snap the necks of wintering wood pigeons and fat pheasants. But simply killing the animal was only the first bloody step in the grand equation of survival. Fresh, raw meat spoils surprisingly fast, even in the freezing ambient temperatures of a winter forest. The outlaws meticulously smoked their fresh kills over low, smoldering fires for grueling days on end. They effectively transformed the raw flesh into deeply preserved jerky that could safely last for many months. This heavy, dried meat could be eaten stone cold while hiding in absolute silence, especially during those terrifying moments when sparking a fire would instantly reveal their position to a passing patrol. But all these brilliant hunting and trapping strategies relied on the presence of wild animals that were quickly vanishing into the frozen earth. The ultimate test of survival arrived when the forest animals completely disappeared, leaving the outlaws to face a landscape that looked entirely dead. The forest in January is a deceptive, blinding white graveyard. To the untrained eye, it is a barren wasteland of skeletal branches and frozen mud. An ordinary man lost in this white hell would starve to death in a matter of days. But these outlaws possessed ancient, forbidden botanical knowledge. They knew exactly how to extract life from a landscape that appeared completely dead. Let us examine the humble, seemingly useless acorn. If a starving man desperately eats raw acorns, the high concentration of toxic tannins will cause agonizing stomach cramps and violent sickness. He will die clutching his stomach in the snow, a victim of his own ignorance. The outlaws engineered a brilliant passive solution. They gathered thousands of these bitter nuts and buried them deep within the gravel of a fast-flowing icy stream. For 3 agonizing weeks, they patiently waited. They let the freezing, rushing water naturally leach away all the poisonous, bitter nastiness. When they finally retrieved their hidden cache, they possessed a safe, starchy base that could be ground into a life-saving, flour-like paste. They also became masters of psychological warfare against the forest's smallest residents. Throughout the crisp days of autumn, cautious outlaws meticulously stalked busy squirrels. They memorized the exact locations where these frantic creatures buried their winter hoards. When the deepest frost set in, the ruthless human survivors simply raided these tiny, hidden vaults before the animals could return. It was a brutal theft, but human survival always trumped nature's fairness. When the stolen nuts ran out, they turned to an act of sheer terrifying desperation. They devoured the trees themselves. It sounds like absolute madness, driven by the delirium of starvation. But the outlaws knew that the inner, fleshy layer of bark on elm, birch, and pine trees held a vital secret. This hidden layer, scientifically known as the cambium, is packed with life-sustaining nutrients. Starving men would aggressively strip the frozen bark, scrape out the pale cambium, and boil it down into a thick, foul-tasting gruel. It tasted like bitter wood and despair, and it was agonizing to choke down. But it forced their organs to keep working and their blood to keep pumping. However, preventing simple starvation was not enough to stop their bodies from decaying. Without proper vitamins, their gums would split and bleed, their teeth would loosen, and minor scratches would fester into rotting, unhealable wounds. Scurvy was a silent, terrifying assassin in the medieval woods. The outlaws defeated this invisible killer by seeking out tiny, bright red jewels hidden in the thick snow. These were rose hips. These resilient little fruits clung stubbornly to thorny bushes straight through the dead of January. The fugitives had no modern scientific understanding of vitamin C, but their primal instincts knew these bitter berries were medicinal magic. Just a handful of frozen rose hips every few days kept their flesh from rotting away. They also harvested bizarre life forms that defied the deadly winter freeze. While most fungi withered and died, certain resilient mushrooms actually thrived in the sub-zero temperatures. The outlaws carefully harvested wood ear and velvet shank mushrooms from the rotting corpses of fallen logs. But this foraging was a deadly game of Russian roulette. One slight misidentification, one poisonous mushroom dropped into the evening stew, guaranteed an agonizing, foaming death for the entire camp. True knowledge of these wild edibles was treated as sacred currency, whispered in the dark between trusted allies. Yet, a man can have a full stomach and still die a miserable death surrounded by millions of gallons of frozen water. This is the greatest, most cruel paradox of the medieval winter. The entire world is buried in snow and draped in glittering heavy icicles, but severe dehydration slaughtered far more outlaws than the sheriff's hangman ever did. The desperate instinct of an exhausted, thirsty man is to simply grab a handful of pristine snow and shove it into his parched mouth. This is an act of slow, self-inflicted suicide. When you ingest frozen snow, your struggling core must burn massive amounts of precious, irreplaceable calories just to melt it inside your stomach. This violently plunges your internal core temperature directly into the fatal danger zone. You are literally trading vital hydration for deadly hypothermia. Furthermore, the thermodynamic math is completely stacked against human survival. It requires roughly 10 massive handfuls of fluffy snow just to yield a single pathetic gulp of actual liquid water. Attempting to melt that much snow over a fire meant keeping a massive, highly visible blaze burning all day, which would instantly summon the king's executioners. To survive this frozen desert, smart outlaws mapped out the hidden anatomy of the forest waterways. They desperately sought out the narrowest, fastest-moving sections of deep streams. The violent kinetic energy of rushing water naturally resists freezing, even in the most brutal sub-zero temperatures. By locating a hidden micro-waterfall, or a compressed, rushing gap between jagged rocks, an outlaw could cup his hands and drink sweet, flowing water without ever striking a single spark. They also turned their eyes upward to the crystal daggers hanging from the cliffs. While any fool could snap an icicle off a low pine branch, the veterans knew these were contaminated with bird droppings, rotting sap, and dead insects. Instead, they exclusively harvested the massive, clear icicles suspended directly from solid rock faces. The natural stone acted as a perfect, prehistoric filtration system, purifying the runoff before it froze. It was nature's purest water, suspended in mid-air. But successfully finding liquid water was only the beginning of a terrifying daily struggle. Carrying that water through a freezing night without it turning into a solid block of useless ice was an absolute nightmare. They utilized stolen leather flasks and cured animal bladders as primitive canteens. Before sleeping, a desperate outlaw would shove this freezing, water-filled bladder deep beneath his wool cloak, pressing the cold leather directly against his bare, shivering chest. He forced his own agonizing body heat to keep the water liquid through the darkest, coldest hours of the night. It was pure, freezing torture that prevented any deep sleep. But waking up to a solid, undrinkable ice ball in the morning meant certain death. The silent, invisible cruelty of winter dehydration is that it entirely masks your own thirst. The freezing winter air is aggressively, painfully dry. With every single frosty breath an outlaw exhaled, a visible cloud of essential moisture was permanently stolen from his lungs. They were slowly, invisibly bleeding water vapor into the frozen sky every single second of the day. Therefore, survival demanded a brutal, uncompromising discipline. A man had to force himself to drink icy, throat-numbing water even when his freezing body screamed that it was not thirsty at all. But maintaining hydration and a full stomach was a completely futile effort if a man tried to fight the medieval winter entirely alone. The ancient, frozen forest had its own brutal, unforgiving laws of socialization, where isolation meant an immediate death sentence. Picture a man staring at a handful of stolen silver coins, his hands violently trembling in the dark. He realizes with absolute horror that this glittering fortune is completely worthless. You cannot eat silver. You cannot burn silver to warm your frostbitten toes. In the brutal, frozen abyss of the medieval forest, a single sack of coarse salt was infinitely more valuable than a king's ransom. Salt meant preserved meat, and preserved meat meant surviving until the spring thaw. This was the twisted reality of the winter camps, where isolation was a guaranteed death sentence, and the lone wolf always died first. The harsh mathematics of survival dictated that a solitary outlaw had roughly half the survival rate of those who banded together. If you tried to sleep alone in a freezing bender shelter, your core temperature would plummet, and you would quietly slip into a permanent sleep. But if 3 desperate men huddled tightly together beneath a stolen wool cloak, their combined radiant body heat could artificially raise the ambient temperature of their tiny shelter by 10 degrees or more. This was not a romantic display of brotherhood. This was pure, unadulterated thermodynamics actively saving human lives. However, you could not simply invite every starving wanderer into your hidden sanctuary. The absolute sweet spot for a functioning outlaw band was strictly between 5 and 15 individuals. If your group had fewer than 5 people, the monumental daily chores of gathering wet firewood, checking distant snares, and melting ice would quickly exhaust and kill you. If your camp swelled beyond 15 hungry mouths, the surrounding forest was rapidly stripped of all edible life. Furthermore, a massive, uncoordinated group left a chaotic trail of broken branches and deep footprints that even a blind sheriff could easily follow. Within these perfectly sized groups, a strict, ruthless division of labor transformed a band of criminals into a highly efficient micro-society. Every single calorie of energy was meticulously calculated. During the darkest months of winter, the sun offered a pathetic 8 hours of weak daylight. One man was ordered to religiously tend the smokeless Dakota fire hole. Another phantom moved silently through the brush to check the rabbit snares. A designated sentry perched high in a freezing oak tree, scanning the white horizon for the bright banners of mounted patrols. The rest of the camp frantically scoured the frozen earth for edible roots and hidden nuts. This precise multiplication of effort was not merely helpful, it was the fundamental architecture of human survival. These isolated camps did not exist in a total vacuum. A shadowy, deeply trusted network of communication developed along the hidden, icy game trails. Allied outlaw bands would cautiously share vital intelligence about which regions were heavily patrolled and which valleys still held wandering deer. It was a highly primitive, medieval version of social media, but instead of trading meaningless likes, they traded frantic warnings about heavily armed men actively trying to murder them. Yet, the venomous serpent of betrayal was always slithering through the winter snow. Countless hardened outlaws were abruptly captured in their sleep because a desperate, starving companion secretly traded their exact location for a royal pardon. It is a horrifying reality, but from a psychological standpoint, it is incredibly difficult to judge them. Imagine starving in the agonizing depths of February, your toes turning black with the irreversible rot of frostbite, when suddenly the local sheriff offers you a roaring fireplace, a bowl of hot mutton stew, and a completely clean legal slate. That is a devil's bargain that many broken men simply could not refuse. As the winter dragged on, the largest and most successful camps organically evolved into entirely functioning, illegal villages operating right under the king's nose. Women and children lived in these hidden sanctuaries, complex social hierarchies formed, and natural leaders emerged from the chaos. But this growth exposed an uncomfortable, undeniable truth about human nature. You cannot simply forage enough roots to feed a hidden village. To survive the darkest months, these outlaws were forced to aggressively take what they desperately needed directly from the people who possessed it. Winter raiding required a terrifying level of tactical planning and cold-blooded execution. The prime targets were never heavily fortified castles, but rather the isolated, wealthy monasteries and remote agricultural manors. These religious and noble estates stockpiled massive, tempting mountains of grain, salted pork, thick wool blankets, and heavy iron tools specifically to outlast the winter. They functioned exactly like giant medieval Costco warehouses, sitting totally exposed in the rural countryside with shockingly minimal security. But the veterans who successfully raided these targets did not blindly charge through the front gates swinging rusty swords. That reckless behavior guaranteed a swift execution or a bloody death in the snow. The intelligent predators lurked in the freezing shadows for days, meticulously observing the daily routines of their prey. They memorized exactly when the tired guards switched shifts. They noted exactly where the vicious guard dogs were kenneled. They carefully mapped out which wooden barns held the precious grain versus which buildings housed armed, sleeping soldiers. Timing was the absolute key to a successful raid. They patiently waited for the sky to darken and a heavy, blinding snowfall to begin. Under the cover of a raging blizzard, they struck with terrifying speed, grabbing everything they could physically carry, and vanished back into the endless trees like ghosts. By the time the morning sun rose, the heavy, fresh snow had completely erased their frantic tracks. The furious sheriff's men would find absolutely nothing but a smooth, pristine white field leading to an impenetrable wall of dark timber. Interestingly, not every single encounter between the outlaws and the local civilization ended in bloodshed. Historical records suggest that many isolated peasant villages actually engaged in secret, pragmatic negotiations with the local bandit kings. If you view this through the pragmatic lens of a medieval farmer, it makes perfect, terrifying sense. Why risk your life fighting a desperate, heavily armed group of outlaws who might retaliate by burning your vital winter hay stores to the ground? It was far safer to quietly trade a few sacks of surplus grain and some woven cloth in exchange for a solemn promise of protection and immunity. Practical survival always beats heroic martyrdom in the real world. The most forward-thinking outlaws did not just steal immediate calories, they specifically targeted agricultural tools, heavy axes, and bags of viable planting seeds. This reveals a profound psychological truth. Deep down in their battered souls, these fugitives never planned to die as feral beasts in the woods. They were desperately hoping for eventual royal pardons, secretly planning to rebuild legitimate, peaceful lives in the distant future. They fought to survive today, but their eyes were always fixed on the promise of tomorrow. Despite their tactical genius, every single raid was a massive, life-threatening gamble. One poorly timed attack, one terrified witness who managed to escape into the dark, or one guard dog that barked 3 seconds too early meant that the game was violently over. But the ultimate grim reaper of the medieval forest did not carry a sheriff's badge or a hangman's noose. The true killer arrived in late February, and it had absolutely nothing to do with human laws. If you believe that every outlaw ended their story swinging wildly from a hemp rope, you have been lied to by romantic ballads. The historical reality is far less dramatic and significantly darker. Royal pardons were actually surprisingly common during this era. When ambitious kings desperately needed expendable soldiers to fight brutal, grinding wars in France or Scotland, they suddenly became incredibly forgiving of past transgressions. Murder, grand theft, and even the ultimate sin of poaching the royal deer were instantly forgiven if you agreed to carry a bloody spear into a foreign meat grinder. It is darkly amusing how supposedly unforgivable crimes become highly negotiable when a monarch requires disposable cannon fodder. But the vast majority of these woodland fugitives were never killed by the king's justice. They were silently slaughtered by microscopic enemies. Severe pneumonia brought on by one too many freezing, wet nights sleeping in a damp pit house. Minor cuts and scrapes that quickly turned into horrific gangrenous wounds due to a complete lack of hygiene. Violent, dehydrating dysentery contracted from drinking contaminated, stagnant water. The legendary Sherwood Forest was not a romantic, sun-dappled playground for heroes in green tights. It was effectively a massive, freezing, medieval hospital waiting room where your name was never called. And then came the terrifying phenomenon known to historians and farmers as the Hungry Gap. This was the brutal, agonizing period in late February and early March when all the carefully hoarded winter food finally ran out, but the fresh, edible spring plants had not yet emerged from the frozen soil. Historical accounts exist of heavily armed sheriffs finally discovering remote outlaw camps hidden deep in the wilderness. They breached the perimeter expecting a violent, bloody ambush. Instead, they found the camps completely silent and entirely empty of life. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood in the snow and no weapons drawn. They only found emaciated bodies curled up under frozen wool blankets. The people had simply stopped. Starvation does not always roar. Sometimes it merely whispers you to sleep. Some outlaws did manage to escape this green hell through bizarre twists of legal fate. If a distant relative suddenly died and a fugitive legally inherited a piece of taxable land, that desperate, starving criminal could casually walk out of the woods and back into town as a respected property owner. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, nobody asked uncomfortable questions when valuable real estate and new taxes were suddenly involved. As for the legendary mythological figures who supposedly lived for 30 or 40 years as untamed lords of the Greenwood, documented historical averages prove that the maximum survival span for a hardened outlaw was roughly 2 to 7 brutal years. That is the absolute limit of human endurance. The idea of Robin Hood surviving for 4 decades in the freezing depths of Sherwood Forest is either pure, unadulterated fiction, or he had a phenomenally wealthy accountant hiding him in a heated manor house in France. The rugged few who somehow survived multiple agonizing winters became the most valuable commodities in the underworld. They evolved into master teachers. Their hard-won knowledge of subterranean shelter building, invisible fire management, and chemical food preservation was the only thing that kept the terrified newcomers from dying on their first night. In the deep woods, raw survival experience became a currency far more powerful and respected than stolen silver or gold. These medieval outlaws were not the flawless, noble heroes of childhood fables, nor were they the mindless, evil villains depicted in royal edicts. They were ordinary, desperate human beings violently caught between a freezing, apathetic wilderness and a cruel, rigged legal system that offered them nothing but the gallows. Some fought their way out and found a path back to civilization. Many died quietly, their bones sinking forever into the frozen mud. Others simply walked away from the trees one sunny morning, entirely abandoned their past lives, and prayed that the village elders did not recognize their weathered faces. The medieval forest was never a glorious fantasy of unlimited freedom. It was the ultimate, uncompromising test of human biological endurance and psychological resilience. Most ordinary people failed that test horribly. But the extraordinary ones who survived the ice, the hunger, and the hunters were undeniably tougher, smarter, and far more dangerous than any romantic legend will ever give them credit for. If you want to discover more brutal truths about human survival, ancient history, and the primal skills that kept our ancestors alive against all odds, do not let this knowledge slip away. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join our tribe at Primal Methods, where we uncover the forgotten secrets of the past to make you stronger today.